Hi, welcome to our first focus on assessment. And my goal for you with this lecture is that you get a beginning working understanding of the different kinds of assessments that are out there. And so we're going to kind of populate your vocabulary. In this lecture, I'll give it a little bit of meaning. I've really carefully chosen the readings that follow this, and I think all of them are good. Each of them puts different parts of these ideas in slightly different words, and I think sometimes it's really helpful to hear it from your instructor, to hear it from a couple of different authors. And so, and then what we're going to do with this is we're headed to the discussion, and we'll really put it into action, and we will talk about coming up with an assessment plan for a new program. And then there will be a quiz as well at the end just to make sure that you've got a sense of what all of these terms mean, a clear sense, and that when given an example of an assessment, you can use these terms to describe it. Okay, so this is a great place for us to begin around assessment. So I've got a lot of terms up here, and we're going to walk through them bit by bit. And again, I'm going to go a little fast because your readings really go deeper down, and many times I think they put it into better words than I can. So I'm just going to give the big overview, and then you're going to probably fill in some of the details with those readings. All right. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the difference between test and assessment. A lot of people think that they mean the same thing, but they're actually very different. Assessment can include tests. Tests are just a subcategory of assessment. Assessment means evaluating something, finding out something that helps you evaluate where someone is or to judge something. And a test is one way that that can happen. A test tends to be, it's very formal, and it's often paper and pencil, right? It's been pre-planned, and there is a score or a grade that comes out of it. And so that is just one subcategory of what assessment is. Assessment is much bigger than that. But today, we're going to talk about different kinds of assessments, which often what we're talking about are different kinds of tests. And so just to kind of paint the big picture. Another set of terms, and one of the chapters that you'll look at does a really good job of pulling these apart for you, is making sure that you understand the difference between measurement and evaluation. Measurement, when we measure something, that means that we're looking for a quantitative score that we can put on someone's, what they've produced on, usually on a test. But it's some kind of quantitative score that we can come up with. Evaluation means gathering information so you can make a decision. Gathering information so you can make a decision. Has a student learned enough English they can exit the program? That would be an example of evaluation. Has a student gained enough English that they are ready for the next level? That is a sense of evaluation. So measurement is putting a number on something, and evaluation is making a decision based on something. Okay, all right. So as I mentioned, one of the chapters does a great job of pulling those apart, but I just wanted to introduce those here in the lecture. And then let's talk about 5 different tests, these 5 different tests that for all of you who are headed out to work with English language learners in a variety of situations, maybe 3rd grade in Wenatchee, or high schoolers in Japan, or adults in Argentina, wherever it is that you're headed, these are the kinds of assessments that you're going to encounter on a regular basis. So let's just kind of get a general sense together, and then like I mentioned, the readings do a great job of painting the details in there. Achievement tests are the tests that are given that find out whether or not a student has learned material in a particular curriculum. So an achievement test, an example of this would be the quiz that you take at the end of a unit, or it would be a final exam that you take at the end of a course. And so it's finding out, in this particular course, or in this particular unit, or in this particular week, or on this particular day, did a student master the material that was learned? And so that is an example of an achievement test. Let's say that you are working really hard with your students to master whether or not, to help them tell the difference between B and V when they hear those sounds. Maybe all of your students who are English language learners really struggle with the difference between that. So you might give an achievement, some kind of achievement test at the end to find out, did they master that? When I speak words that have those different sounds, can they hear the difference? Okay? So did learning happen? That's an achievement test. A diagnostic test is focused around a particular student. So it's a test that's given to an individual student or perhaps to a group of students, but the focus is on the individual. And the purpose is to find out, what are the challenges that the student has right now, and what are their strengths? And what does it tell us? What do we need to focus on? What do we need to work on with this particular student? So diagnostic tests might be given to an entire group of students, but the focus is each student will have kind of an individual plan. That teacher will have an individual plan. Or maybe the teacher finds out that everybody is struggling with the difference between the B and V sound. And so it'll be covered for everyone, but really in the back of the teacher's mind is that individual focus. So that is a diagnostic test. Find out the strengths or the challenges of an individual student and then come up with a plan that meets that individual student's needs. An example of when I've used a diagnostic test, when I was working with a pharmacist at Holy Family Hospital in Spokane. I was doing pronunciation work with her. The nurses were not able to understand her, so I gave her a diagnostic test. There are many online for pronunciation. I chose one, and I gave that to her, and I was able to analyze and figure out, what about English pronunciation does she already know, and what do we need to work on? So that is a diagnostic test. A placement test. The focus of a placement test is to find out, in a program that has different levels, which level is appropriate for a student. So an example of a placement test in Washington State, for those of you headed to K-12, you will encounter the WELPA, or the ELPA 21. I forget which one it's called. And what this test does is it finds out, for those students who've been identified as English language learners, it finds out which of the levels are they at, which level of support is appropriate for them. Are they beginners? Are they expanding? Where are they? And so that's an example of a placement test. If you head off at any point to teach university students, international students in a university who still need some help with their language, the intensive English program will have a placement test. And what the score on a the score on a placement test, those score ranges tell the instructors which level is appropriate for the student, just like on the WELPA, right, for K-12, just like for a placement test or an intensive English program, it tells them which level is appropriate. So that is the purpose of a placement test. What is a proficiency test? A proficiency test is a big standardized test that's given to thousands and tens of thousands, or probably hundreds of thousands of learners, and it gives you a sense of where is this English learner, French learner, or Arabic learner, where are they on that proficiency scale? So compared to everyone else who has mastered or is in the process of mastering the language, where are they? And then it gives them a category. Are they beginning? Are they low intermediate? Are they high intermediate? Are they advanced? Where are they? And so that is a proficiency test. It says where your level of language learning is. An aptitude test. Now, for those of you who happen to have taken Second Language Acquisition, ESLG 480 already, you've already encountered the word aptitude. We spent about 3 minutes on it in the Second Language Acquisition course when we were talking about individual differences. What makes one language learner different from another English language learner? And aptitude means, what's your natural ability? Are you just built like a language learner? In other words, your brain is especially good at the things that tend to make a good language learner. That's what an aptitude test is. And the reason that I spend so little time talking about aptitude or aptitude tests is because hopefully if you're taking other courses in this program, or even if this is your only one, you will be convinced that instructors can do an amazing job at choosing strategies, arranging, designing their lessons, supporting students one-on-one and in small groups, and motivating students so that that can overpower whether or not someone is just built as a naturally good language learner or not. Now, an aptitude test is a test to find out, does the person's brain, is it wired to be especially good at what it takes to be a good language learner? So what are they testing on an aptitude test? They're not testing a particular language. They're testing things like, do you have a good memory? Do you have a good oral ability to differentiate sounds? Can you recognize patterns really well? That's what they're looking for. If someone's ear is really good, they're really good at memorization, they're really good at quickly recognizing patterns, they are coming into language learning with already an advanced skill set. And so kind of the cards are stacked for them. And if I were to take an aptitude test, I highly suspect my score would be really low. My memory isn't that good. My ear is my weakest ability. I am not a good listener. It takes me a long time to be able to differentiate two things. Am I good at recognizing patterns? I'm so-so. I'm so-so. But over my time learning languages, my motivation and my ability to organize and to bring in everything that I already know, I would like to think offsets my low aptitude. Okay, but why is this up here? Aptitude tests are a very real thing, and they are used by organizations that are trying to determine whether or not they should invest in someone to learn a language. So let's say that you're in the military and you get chosen or suggested, or you suggest yourself as someone who would like to learn languages as part of your skill set in the military. Or you want to do that as part of the foreign service. You want to do that in the government. You would be given an aptitude test so that the government, so that the military could decide, is it worth investing their money in you, or are you going to take Spanish 101 7 times before you pass it, right? And so that's what an aptitude test is. So very quickly, let's just go back over the types. And again, in 2 of the chapters, they will be covered. So that'll kind of add some understanding that I haven't covered here. Achievement tests, they are connected to a course. They are connected to a unit. They're connected to learning. And the question that they answer is, did the student learn the material? Diagnostic tests are focused on the individual. And what the question they're asking is, what are this individual student's strengths? What are their weaknesses? What do we need to focus on with this student? So this is focused on learning. This is focused on an individual student. A placement test, the question that's being asked is, which of the levels is appropriate for this particular student? A score from the placement test. A student takes the placement test, you get a score, you look at which range it fits into, and you place them in that level. So a placement test is all about placing a student in a particular program. A proficiency test is finding out for an individual student, compared to all the other learners, what is their language proficiency right now. So it's not about any particular course that they've taken. It's not trying to identify what their particular strengths or weaknesses are. It's just comparing them to everybody else to have a sense of where they are in that continuum as they're learning language. An aptitude test is focused on basically the way a student or a learner or a person's brain works. Are they wired to be a naturally good language learner? Okay. Now, I mentioned that that these types of tests are answering different questions. And one of the things that I'll send you to, one of the links that you'll take a look at is, what are the questions that different stakeholders are asking and how are they answered by assessments? Stakeholder is a fancy word. We most often see it come up, say, in business language. And stakeholder means the people who are invested in the outcome, right? So, for example, with a placement test, who would the stakeholders be? The stakeholders, first of all, it would be the students taking the test. They want to make sure that they are placed accurately. Another stakeholder for a placement test would be the teachers who are going to inherit the students who have just taken that test and been placed based on it. They really, really want that placement assessment to work, because if it doesn't, they have a problem. They either have a really angry student because the student is placed lower than they should be, or they have an overwhelmed and scared student because the student has been placed higher than they should be. And who else? Who's another stakeholder? The parents of those students, the families of those students, and also the director of the program. If the director of the program can't count on those placement decisions being made well, they have a big problem on their hands, coming at them from everybody. The families, the students, the teachers, everybody's angry. So stakeholders is just a fancy word, and we'll be using it several times throughout this course. Fancy way of saying who has a stake in the outcomes of these decisions. Okay. Now we're going to move on. We're going to change gears a little bit. And there's a handout that goes with this lecture, and I haven't made reference to it yet, but here is what it looks like. And I think that life might work best for you if you print this out and you take notes on it, or perhaps after you just take notes on what I'm about to say and then you compare it with the handout afterwards. Okay. So what we're going to do at this point is we're gonna talk about different types of tests in a different way. We talked about different types of tests here in terms of what their purpose is. Now we're going to talk about different types of tests based on their characteristics. Okay. So you can see that they are in pairs. And what I'm going to try to do is to help you pull these apart, but you're going to hate me for this. It's also not as simple as this chart makes it look. It makes it look like it's either summative or formative. It's either high stakes or low stakes. It's either selected response or it's constructed response. You've probably figured out now, as an adult, by now, that actually often things are not in dichotomies, but rather it's a spectrum. And so we're going to use these terms, not just this week, we're going to be drawing on these terms as long as we're talking about assessment. And what we may do is encounter examples. They're a little bit of selected response and a little bit of constructed response. So there's a combination of both. Okay. So that said, that disclaimer, let's take a look. And I really think anything that perhaps my lecture today doesn't make sense of, the handout will, and then there's made reference in some of the readings as well. So let's jump in. Let's see where this ends us. Okay, so summative versus formative. We talk about summative assessment, we talk about formative assessment. Summative assessment is a fancy way of saying an assessment that comes at the end of something. So it's the sum, right? It's the sum of the learning, or it's basically that's it. It's the sum of the learning. So a summative assessment might be a test that you give at the end of a unit, right? The unit's over, there's no going back, unit's over, and what did students learn, okay? Now, formative assessment is very different. Formative is in the moment. Formative is where are we now and where do we need to go next. Formative assessment happens in the midst of the learning. You might stop a lesson mid-lesson, recognize that you're not sure that everybody understands a key point, and you ask a question or you give a task or you do something else that you find out, do students understand this part? Because otherwise I need to loop back and reteach it. And if almost everyone understands, you move on, right? That is formative assessment. It can happen on the fly. It can happen unplanned. But formative assessment can also be planned as well. Formative might be, there are exit tickets, right? So you think ahead to your lesson, you realize, if I asked this question or gave this task at the end, and students handed it in as they were walking out the door, I'd have a sense on whether or not we got where we needed to today, or where are those pieces that still need to be filled in. With formative assessment, you're finding out what they understand right now so you can impact tomorrow's teaching, or the next hour's teaching, or the next step that you take in today's lesson. Summative, game's over. There's no reteaching, game's over. Now, okay, talking about the spectrum, now I'm going to complicate things a little bit. In truth, most teachers, whenever they can, when they get the results of a summative assessment, they often do offer feedback to students, or they often do reteach something. So you might, for example, take a history class, and at the end of the first unit, everyone takes that test. You come back in the next Monday, the teacher hands them back, and the teacher, now that was summative, right? The teacher can launch right into Unit 2. But they may choose to do what I do, which is to say, okay, everybody, couple of things here. Most of you still don't understand the difference between this and this. Let's spend a couple of minutes and let's try to get there together today. Or you might say, okay, everybody, when you wrote your essays, most of you did not name the central idea. Let's talk for a moment about what does a good essay on an exam look like, okay? So sometimes we give summative assessments that it's not the end of the road. We do try to connect those back to our teaching. I think most of us do. But sometimes there are true summative assessments, even for me. I don't usually give final exams, but when I do, it really is game over. The course has ended, the Canvas course has ended by the time I read and enter the grades of those final exams. There is no looping back with students, there really isn't. So that truly is summative. Okay, let's talk about another pair, and I think these will be easier to understand because we hear them a lot, at least high stakes, in the kind of the popular media, the popular discussion about education. There's high stakes assessments and there's low stake assessments. What do they essentially mean? High stakes means that whatever the outcome of this assessment is, that there is a huge impact on the student. When I think of high stakes assessments, language assessments, I think about the English assessments that are given to Korean or Japanese students who want to go on to the university. And knowing a certain amount of English is necessary. That is part of getting into the university. Get a low score, guess what? You're not going to college anywhere, right? Unless you leave and you go to the United States, which ironically uses English. Anyways, so that's an example of high stakes. What's low stakes? There is little, if any, impact on a student. You have, for example, you give a little mini quiz when students come in, because you're starting to suspect that they're not actually doing the reading that you're asking them to do. So they walk in, you give them a surprise mini quiz. It either has very little impact on the student's grade, or perhaps it doesn't even show up in the grade book. You were just trying to find out, are they doing the reading or are they not? So that would be an example of low stakes assessment. There's standardized, or we sometimes call them commercial assessments, and then there's classroom-based or teacher-constructed assessments. Standardized assessments are created by people in a cramped little office in Virginia or DC, and they have never met your students, nor will they ever. They are completely disconnected from the students who are actually taking the assessment. They're far away, and there's a disconnect. And because they're standardized, they are normed across huge numbers of students, big populations in diverse areas. So the idea is that when you get this score, it doesn't just mean something for this student or this class or this program. It actually has a meaning that connects way beyond your context. And so that's a benefit of standardized commercial assessments. There are also, of course, classroom-based or teacher-constructed assessments. This is what I use when I am teaching language learners. I am constructing my own assessments, or I'm reaching back to assessments I've used for many years, or I'm reaching to something that a fellow teacher in my same program used, and maybe I'm tweaking it for this year's students. Those are all examples of classroom-based or teacher-constructed. And in those examples, the person who creates the assessment is someone who knows the students. There's a direct connection there. Okay, there's also selected response versus constructed response. And selected response means that, for example, the easiest example is true-false. Students are taking an assessment, and there's a long list of items, and each one has true or false. Students simply select the response that they believe is the correct one. And there is no teacher judgment that is needed for this. It's what's called objective. Ideally, the assessment is so good that no judgment is used at all. And you can use a machine, for example, to grade these if you have a Scantron machine at your school or at your program. Or you could even have, if it's allowed, you could have a teaching assistant grade them as well. They've got the key. Number 1 is true, number 2 is false, right? And they just follow that. And no teacher judgment is needed. Constructed response, students are creating a sentence, or they're creating a paragraph, they're creating an essay. They are recording themselves say a sentence. They're recording themselves say a word. They're recording themselves giving a 3-minute speech, that kind of thing. So they are having to actually create something with language. That's the constructed response. And this calls for a lot of teacher judgment. There has to be some kind of teacher judgment that comes into play to decide what's an acceptable response, what's an unacceptable response, what's an over and above response, what does that look like? And so some kind of descriptors have to be created. We'll spend some time talking about rubrics later in talking about assessment. Very much connected. You're going to see that these are very much connected. We also sometimes talk about objective assessments and performance assessments. And really, these two go together. Because if you're selecting your response from multiple choice or from true-false, it is, we say, objective. Now, we're going to dig down into cultural validity and see. There might be some judgment going on, but ideally, it's completely objective. And If a student is carrying out a constructed response assessment, that means they're having to perform language. They're having to do something. They're having to look at a set of questions and explain to you what they think happened. And of course, you are writing down verbatim, or you are recording with an audio recorder exactly what they say. And so these two really go together. You can't pull those apart. But they're different ways. They're terms that you need to know because they come up in the literature, and we'll use them. And then there are independent or discrete or integrative or integrated or interactive assessments. Now, I'm going to pull these apart, but this is one where really there is a true spectrum. And as students have kind of encountered this over time, I've really seen students struggle with this spectrum. I encourage you just to let the spectrum be, and just to start to recognize when there's elements of both on an assessment. But what does this mean? Independent or discrete assessment means it's an assessment of a specific skill and possibly a specific sub-skill. So for example, a discrete assessment, let's go back to the example. You have some students that you suspect are still struggling with hearing the difference between ba and va in English. They're still not able to tell the difference of what they're hearing. So you might give them a discrete assessment in which they have, on their papers, you have them number to 20, and number 1, you say a word, and all they have to do is to, on their paper, write down what's the first sound of that word. Was it a ba word or a va word? If it's a ba word, they write B. If it's a va word, they write V, right? That is a discrete assessment, because you are just finding out this tiny little sub-skill of listening, which is, can they understand the difference between B and V? So that's very, very discrete. The assessment tells you one tiny little detail of your language learner's development, okay? Now, at the other end of that spectrum, we have real-world use of English or real-world use of any language. You might go on, for example, and be a French teacher at some point, and so you are carrying out real-world assessments of people's use of French. But for here, we're talking about English. And so in the real world, we put our sub-skills together, we put our skills together. Let's say, for example, a student is trying to figure out which bus to take to get to the plaza downtown in Spokane. They would probably be doing some reading on the bus schedule. They would probably do some speaking. They would be asking questions to other people or to the bus driver. They would be listening to those responses, and they might even need to write something down. So that's a real world use of English. In the real world, we use reading, writing, listening, speaking, and all the little sub-skills. Are they having to hear some words that start with B or start with V? Probably. But we're not just testing that tiny thing. An interactive test is allowing students to use all of those skills, or many skills, or some skills and sub-skills together. So what would an example of an interactive test be? One type of assessment that I often use when I'm working on listening and speaking with adult international students is I give them an assessment in which I read sentences aloud 3 times. So each sentence is read 3 times, first at fairly normal speed, second time broken down into pieces, and third time at normal speed. And the students hear that, and then they write down what they think they hear. And I encourage them to apply anything they already understand about grammar, anything they already understand about spelling patterns in English, and apply that. Now, that's also a listening assessment, but it's very different than this one, because what are they having to do? They are listening, and then they are writing. And not only are they writing, but I'm encouraging them to apply rules that they've already learned about how grammar works. I'm also encouraging them to reread the sentence and see if in the rereading of it they can catch any errors that they've made. So is it a listening assessment? Yes. But it's listening more like the way we carry it out in the real world, in which we're listening, but we're also writing, we're reading back over it, we're trying to apply what we know. And so that type of assessment is more interactive than it is discrete. Okay. So I hope that what this has done is it has given you a sense of some of the ways that we use terms, we use categories to make sense of the different kinds of assessments that we as teachers of English language learners are going to be expected to kind of be really understand these differences and actually be able to create them or to be able to work with them, to be able to use them, apply them. And for some of these, like formative, take that information and reshape what we do as teachers. Okay, so I know this was a whirlwind, but I'm very hopeful that the readings that follow and then the work that we do together in the discussion will help you make sense of this and really start to get a sense of what these terms mean, how these tests look different, and when I throw out a test to you, an assessment to you, you'll be able to place it in the right category and to use the right descriptors to talk about it. Okay, tackle those readings and I'll see you in the discussion.